Hi, and welcome to the Heights Baptist Podcast. My name is Lee, and I'm the lead pastor here at Heights. And we want to thank you for joining us, whether you are joining us on our YouTube page or on your audio podcast app. On our podcast, we have not only previous sermons that are preached, but episodes such as this that are designed to help you take just your next step of faith. And so we usually follow them up with the sermons that were just preached to kind of give us a little more deeper dive in our application of the text and maybe answer some of those questions that you could have had from the sermon. So I'm joined today by our co-host and podcast extraordinaire, Pastor Matt Hogan.
Can I put that on my resume? Podcast extraordinaire?
Well, I was going to say worship pastor and media and podcast extraordinaire.
There you go.
I was recently, we were in a meeting with some other folks, and they were discussing the podcast, and someone said that I'm the one that always asks you the hard questions. And then I just, but I explained I'm kind of the host.
That's right.
That's the job. So.
Well, and the reason why that's important is that means you can come behind me and clean up anything that I got wrong.
Right. No. So we are, speaking of cleaning up, we're in a series still called A Beautiful Mess.
Beautiful Mess.
And we're
almost done with A Beautiful Mess, but we're not almost done with 1 Corinthians.
Right. Yes. So this last sermon that was preached was the end of the Beautiful Mess series. And then we start relationship status, which will take us through the second part of chapter 6 through chapter 7. And then I think probably this would be a good time, if I'm getting all my dates right, for any of our folks listening today, to remember starting next week in relationship status, kind of a PG-13 warning.
Right.
Because we are going to be talking about some biblical terms.
Right.
So probably the parents who may be listening in the car right now with their kids might want to read ahead.
Right. Yeah. Understand where we're going, because end of chapter 6 and through chapter 7, we're talking about honoring God with our bodies.
Right.
And marriage and singleness and some of the guardrails that God's placed on that. And we're gonna talk about some biblical terms, and we're gonna talk about some real practical issues when it comes to that stuff. So depending on how old your kids are, if you haven't had the appropriate conversations to prepare them for some of the stuff we'll be talking about, just a heads up for parents.
Yeah, we usually keep it PG.
Yeah, usually. But this will definitely be more of a PG-13
Right. We
conversation.
got to bump it up a little bit. So little parental warning there. But today, this should be fairly PG. And this was a tough topic. Really, you get into chapter 5, and we had the church discipline discussion and why accountability is important. Now, today, we're going to kind of come back off the sermon and maybe clean up any of my mess I created in the message and discuss, lawsuits and, court systems and how as Christians do we approach those things.
How do we interact with the legal system?
Yeah, because the problem in 1 Corinthians, Paul's often pointing out like a problem and then a solution for the church. And so the problem in chapter 6, verse 1 is when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? And so what he's getting at in the chapter when he says that is it's kind of like a how dare you?
Yeah.
How dare you take an issue that's within the church and go outside into the culture with it? Why are you not settling it yourselves?
Right.
Because he goes on to talk about, in the end times, we as believers, we participate with Jesus in the judgment of the angels and the unrighteous. I know there's a ton of questions that we're not covering on that one.
Right.
How does that
future episode someday? Yeah.
How does that really work? I've always said if I get to choose in the millennial kingdom what I'm over, can I get the Caribbean or something?
Someplace tropical.
Someplace
warm.
A little, but not as humid as Houston.
Right.
Because I've lived up northeast and now down here, it's like you're either freezing or about to sweat to death. So you have that. So he's kind of saying if you have that kind of wisdom that God's given us to make that kind of application later, why can't you settle things yourselves as brothers and sisters in Christ?
Right.
And then he goes on to say when we go out into the court system in verse 7, and this happens, we lose.
Right.
And I was thinking about that, in litigation, there's a winner and a loser.
Right.
If I sue you and I win the lawsuit, I win, you lost. But what Paul's making the point is, as believers, if we have to take it to the court, no matter who won the litigation, we still lost because an outside world's watching how we deal with one another. So where do we go with this? Like, what did you find as far as maybe some application you were thinking through, or?
Well, I mean, like the reality, like you said, if you go to court, in a sense, we've already lost.
Right.
Because the court system can be a very, very ugly, messy business. Sometimes necessary.
Right.
And I think we'll talk about some places where I think it's important that we involve the legal system, where we involve the authorities, but it's often very messy.
Yeah.
And so, if you're a follower of Jesus and you go into court and things get said and accusations get made, I mean, you are not building the other party up. You are doing everything you can, or maybe you have an attorney whose job it is, to tarnish their name as much as you can to try and build evidence for your side. So the key, I think, is if it's a dispute that with another brother or sister, this almost goes back into kind of the church discipline or the Matthew 18 stuff we talked about last week.
Right.
If you've got a legal grievance, or let's call it maybe a business grievance, some kind of a civil grievance with somebody in the church, before you drag each other to small claims court, sit down. I would say, following the rules of Matthew 18, sit down, just the two of you first.
Yeah.
See if you can come to a resolution of the difference. And I can think very. Just a few weeks ago, I needed to replace the water heater in my house. And so, of course, I called one of the guys in our church who does construction, has a handyman business. You know what I mean? And so building relationships in the church, it's very common for you to have business practices with people in the church. So I can totally see if something were to happen and Brother Greg came over and did a great job with my water heater, and then I didn't pay him what we had agreed, you'd have a problem there. And if that were to have happened, I paid him, by the way. I made sure to pay. I made sure to do good. But and he did a great job. Thank you, Brother Greg. But if something had happened, I'd been like, oh, I'm a little light this week. Maybe can I get you next month? Or if there had been a problem there, then he would have had two options. He could have taken me to court. Or he could have come to me first as a brother and said, hey, brother, I need to get paid. You need to make good on what you've agreed to. And then maybe I'd say, there would be another step where maybe you bring in, again, sort of two or three others, maybe a pastor, maybe somebody in church leadership that can sit down and kind of act as a mediator and say, let's see if we can resolve this in a loving way. That isn't going to involve isn't going to get the legal system involved.
Yeah, because when Paul's talking about in the chapter, he's talking about being defrauded. So we can look at really this is probably a business type thing. So let's talk about real quick when we need to involve maybe attorneys or law enforcement. And I think we really need to be very clear. This is not saying like if something criminally happens to you, don't go to law enforcement. As churches in different denominations over time, I think they've done a very bad job of, if there's a sexual abuse allegation, maybe against a church member or a staff member, there's been a lot of churches in various denominations, including Southern Baptist, that have said, we're going to handle that inside.
In-house.
In-house. That's our business.
We're going to take care of this ourselves.
And so that would be a misapplication of 1 Corinthians 6.
Yes.
If that happens here, if an allegation comes against a staff member or a church member, we involve law enforcement. Immediately. We welcome the investigation. We in no way, shape, or form try to hinder that investigation because we want the truth to come out. And so this isn't preventing somebody who's maybe being abused spousally, physically, a criminal thing. No, that's okay. Paul's not saying don't, go to court or involve law enforcement there. That would be a very misgrossed application here, I think, of the text. And so we need to point that out. But maybe what are some scenarios, I think, where, because we don't want to paint all lawyers in bad light.
Right.
So what would be maybe some practical ways where, okay, we might have to involve a lawyer or the court at some point?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I'm thinking immediately, again, kind of looking at the whole thing through the lens of church discipline and through the lens of Matthew 18 that we talked about last week. I mean, hopefully some of these small minor things can get resolved person to person.
Right.
You know, again, I just think that water heater is a great example. You know, if for some reason I failed to do what he and I had agreed on,
Right.
he could come to me as a brother and say, you know, we got to take care of this.
Yeah.
If that didn't work, bring two or three other trusted
Right.
people who love Jesus. If you're dealing with people that love Jesus, I think you've got lots of options.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with the outside,
Right.
you know, then that's kind of a different conversation. What I would say is, you know, what would be really awesome is if you knew somebody in your church or in your community that's a believer, that's an attorney, that was going to practice law in a loving way.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and we've got a couple of attorneys in our church that have been, you know, wonderful to help us get advice on
Right.
certain legal issues. And,
Yeah.
and there is a way to use the legal system to right a wrong that's been made against you.
Yeah.
And to not demonize the person.
Right.
And to not tear them down.
Yeah.
And not try and destroy them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I think that's worth thinking about.
Right.
You know, thinking of not just, you know, so not only when is it appropriate to use the legal system, and maybe even in a civil way,
Right.
but also like how are you using it?
Yeah, yeah. Because, and I think in business practices, if I'm setting up a business, it's wise to, as a Christian, to call an attorney, get some paperwork properly filed, or if you and I are going into business partnership together, you know, maybe to have an attorney draw up a document for us that we could, you know, sign. You know, that's okay. That's not demonizing the person, like you said, or kind of dragging the other Christian through the mud. You know, we ran into a situation where, let's see, trying to remember my dates. It was back in 2019 with James was with a group, a therapy group up in Pearland. You know, and they were based out of Colorado, was the home base. It was a national group, and there were some things off in the billing with insurance. And I had agreed to a copay that I wasn't getting billed with. What now? You know, and so I called them, and they're like, "Oh, that's insurance." And I call insurance, and they're like, "Oh, no, that's the therapy." But, you know, so it's back and forth, back and forth. But I had told the therapy place, I said, "I'm not paying this bill until we get this resolved."
Right.
You know, and they said, "Well, then we'll turn you over to a bill collector." Well, at that point, I'm like, what do I do? Because, I mean, I don't have the means to fight a bill collector. I'm trying to sort out, you know, this. So I did contact one of our attorneys here in the church, and I said, I might need your help if this goes to this step. And then she said, you know, yes, I can write this kind of a letter. And, you know, we thankfully never had to get to that step. But I think in that point, that's okay to protect yourself, you know, as a believer. Because, again, I was trying to solve it without running to the lawyer first.
Right.
And I think that's what Paul's really getting at here is, as much as you can in those civil matters, try all that you can before you have to go that route.
Right.
You know? So
I think that's a really good point that you bring up when it comes to, it's often a very wise idea to involve an attorney at the beginning of an agreement or a deal.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going in, if you're working on a business arrangement or something, you know, get something written down, get it notarized, get it in writing.
Yeah.
You know, and if it's a contract, if it's something, you know, if it's going to be an ongoing arrangement, have somebody, maybe somebody in your church who's an attorney, look over it.
Right.
Because it's better to do that at the beginning of a relationship than to have to bring an attorney in after everything goes sideways.
Yeah. So, and here's the hard part, I think, out of this discussion is I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to all of our court systems and issues. Besides, criminally, always go to the law. You know,
always involve the appropriate
I think
authorities.
That's pretty clear. What about maybe family disputes? You know, family
that's
law.
A hard one.
You know, that's tough.
Yeah.
How would we maybe navigate through that? See, that's where I'm asking you the hard question first.
That's right. That's right. Again, I've been in this situation, or I've had people come to me with this question before,
Yeah.
or I've known friends that were in this situation before, where either they were married and the marriage dissolved,
Yeah.
and there was a custody issue, or they weren't married, they had kids, and they decided to split up.
Okay.
And sometimes that can be even
Yeah.
trickier.
Yeah.
Because what I have always counseled those people to do is get something in writing.
Right.
You know, that if there's going to be a custody issue,
Yeah.
you know, it's much easier it's better to work that out with an agreement that y'all have sat down and done in writing.
Right.
You know, and so maybe that does mean family court. Maybe that means you go to some kind of an arbitration before you have to go to that level. But
Yeah.
you know, you sit down together and you work out, you know, who's got which days and how
Right.
that's going to work,
Yeah.
because it's much harder. And it's much harder, worse, and messier later on. You know,
Right.
you don't want to be in a situation where, you know, where the mother or father of your kid, you know, throws them in a car and drives away to another state.
Right.
You've got nothing you can do.
Yeah, you got to know something on paper. And
So I do think, you know,
Yeah.
maybe there are options, you know, because family court's incredibly messy. It's
Right.
incredibly painful.
It's hard.
And so I would, you know, maybe there are ways you can avoid
Right.
having to go through that process. But I would say at the very minimum, you know, you work out an agreement,
Right.
and maybe you have attorneys look at that agreement.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and maybe you take it at least to that level.
Right.
So that hopefully you don't end up
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
messy family court situation.
Right, because you could even, between the two parties, you could just get it notarized. Like
Right.
if they sat down and wrote it out, they could go to a notary, get it notarized. That makes it a legal document at that point.
Right.
You know, and so, I think that is good wisdom, because either side, you don't, you know, when you get to family court, unfortunately, sometimes it does get very messy, because one is trying for custody more than the other. And, you know, I mean, I'm just going to put it bluntly, you have to show the person's not fit for the full custody you're
Right.
asking for, and the other person, you know, so that's where all the dirt kind of gets dug up. And,
Yeah.
you know, maybe the kids have to testify and things, and that's hard,
Yeah.
you know. And so there, I think, are some ways that you can work those things out well, you know. So I think, again, because this passage is, I mean, you know, and we have it pointed out, the time Paul's writing in, it's a very Sue happy culture,
Kind of like ours.
kind of like ours, you know. So the culture's not real different. I think that's sometimes so funny, because we think, oh man, that's the Bible days, and that was so old again, and we're so much different than they are. We're like, no, we're not. I mean, like, read it.
Yeah.
This is pretty much
You read
us.
1 Corinthians, and man, sometimes it feels like he's talking about 2021.
Right.
Like,
And sometimes I'm afraid we've gotten worse than Corinth. You
Yeah.
know? And I'm like, oh, they struggle with that now, but boy, would they show up and go, whoa, like it's 2021 and you guys are still, you're worse off than we were. But again, kind of thinking about how we might have to navigate this. And again, there's not a one size fits all answer on can Christians use the court system or sue. Let's talk about, though, because again, the heart of the passage is how we treat people in this process.
Right.
You were telling me a good story before the podcast on a Chick-fil-A and somebody else.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a friend of mine who's a worship leader and a guitar pedal builder that I follow. And he's got a podcast that I listen to, and he has in the last couple of years he has dealt with some cease and desist claims from a couple of different organizations.
Okay.
And one of them was Chick-fil-A.
Oh, wow.
And then more recently there was another very large instrument company that sent him a cease and desist.
Okay.
I mean, and the issue was basically a trademark.
Okay.
He has a pedal called the Chick-delay, and he had this really awesome looking artwork
Yeah.
that's a play on words of their logo.
Okay.
And so it has that C that looks like a
Right,
chicken.
right, yeah.
And he got an email and a phone call one day from an attorney, and he just explained it on his podcast. Like, this person was super nice. The attorney called him up. He's like, look, I know this is not going to be fun. The attorney said, my whole full-time job is to call people up all day long that are using this letter C with the chicken, and let them know that unfortunately, like, that's our trademark, and you're not allowed to use it. He's like, a lot of times it's like mommy blogs,
Right.
You know, that
Yeah.
he said, and he's like, he made this comment that I thought was insightful. He says, my client Chick-fil-A always would rather make a friend than make an enemy. You know, and I just thought that was an insightful way of using the legal system,
Right.
but using it in a way
Yeah.
that's going to treat the other person with dignity, value, and worth.
Right.
And he said that when he got the letter that said, thanks for your time, thanks for resolving the issue, and of course the issue he ended up needing to make different artwork for the
Right.
pedal
Right.
because artwork that didn't have the logo. They had coupons for free chicken sandwiches in the letter,
Yeah.
from the attorney saying, thanks for, what we worked out. And then they did a podcast about it, and they did it from Chick-fil-A eating chicken sandwiches, talking about, the experience. He ran into another issue a little bit later on with a very large instrument manufacturer, and that was not the tone.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was the we're going to sue you into the ground.
Right.
We're going to take every dollar you've ever made.
Right.
We're going to
Yeah.
it was awful.
Yeah.
And so the compare and contrast between an organization and an attorney
Yeah.
that's attempting to do this in a loving way,
Right.
in a respectful way,
Yeah.
versus a lawyer whose job is to basically just yell, scream, and scare.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was insightful, and I
is.
thought if I ever needed to use an attorney,
Right.
if I ever got a letter from an attorney, that would be the letter I would want to get.
Yeah.
Someone who said, hey, let's see if we can make a friend, not an enemy.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. So the Lord's chicken wins again.
The Lord's chicken. Yeah.
No, that's good. So I think that's a good spot to really end, to kind of encourage people. If you have an issue with a brother or sister in Christ, not to, if you at all possible can work it out without having to involve the legal system, then this is again something outside of criminally.
Right.
Give it that best go. And if you have to, you have to at the end of the day, but that's shouldn't be our first response.
Right.
And
then
so-
think about your attitude and your conduct as you do it.
Right.
And maybe see if you can find an attorney that's going to take an approach that's a more loving, respectful, humane approach.
Yeah, that's good. And then slip in some Chick-fil-A gift cards. You never know where it goes.
Always.
Right, that's not a bad practice. Well, we thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. If you have not hit the subscribe button there on your audio app or on our YouTube page, make sure you do that, and that will keep you current on all of our content when it is released. We are also on Facebook if you'd like to click the like button on the Heights Baptist Church Facebook page. If you are in our area, we'd love for you to join us on Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. Here in the Alvin area. If you are not in our area, then you can join us online at the same time on Sunday mornings at 9 a.m., 10:30 a.m. on our Heights Facebook page or our Heights Baptist Church YouTube page. So until next time, we'll begin our relationship status next week. I hope you have a great week. God bless.